Major Nathan Reeves didn't see a lifesaver. He saw a soccer mom in blue scrubs. He saw the kind eyes of a civilian and assumed they had never seen the color of a man's insides. He didn't see the woman who had once navigated a dust-off chopper through a wall of RPG fire in the Helmand province, her boots slick with the blood of an entire squad. He saw weakness where there was only tempered steel. He barked for a real corpsman, oblivious to the fact that the woman reaching for his Ford didn't just know the Marine Corps, she had bled for it. And when she finally rolled up her sleeve, the ink on her skin would silence the entire trauma bay. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The air was a symphony of chaos, the rhythmic hiss-clack of a ventilator and the frantic shouting of a resident who had clearly lost control. At the center of the storm was Major Nathan Reeves. He was a man carved from granite and gunpowder, currently pinned to a gurney by 4 orderlies he could likely kill with his bare hands if he weren't dying. "Get your hands off me," Reeves roared, his voice a guttural rasp. His face was a mask of dried clay and fresh crimson, the remnants of a catastrophic training jump gone wrong. "Major, you have to stay still," a young resident, Dr. Evans, stammered, his hands hovering nervously over Reeves' chest. "I need a medic, not a frat boy in a lab coat." Reeves lunged forward, the monitor screaming as his heart rate spiked. Then she stepped in. Nurse Sarah Mitchell didn't rush. She moved with a calm, surgical precision that cut through the noise. Her hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her scrubs were faded from 1,000 shifts. To Reeves, she looked like a librarian, a civilian who couldn't possibly understand the red zone he was currently trapped in. "Major," she said, her voice a low, steady frequency. "I'm Nurse Mitchell. I'm taking over your line." Reeves' eyes, blown wide with adrenaline and pain, locked onto hers. "No, I want military. I'm not letting a civilian touch me while my chest is caving in." He didn't know that his life depended on the very person he was dismissing, and that her civilian hands were the only ones in the room that didn't tremble. The sky over the California coastline hadn't just fallen, it had shattered. One moment, Major Nathan Reeves was gripped into the jump seat of a CH-53 Super Stallion, the familiar, bone-deep thrum of the rotors promising a routine night insertion exercise. The next, a catastrophic mechanical failure in the tail rotor turned the world into a high-velocity centrifuge. There was no heroic radio call, only the violent, metallic scream of a 20-ton bird losing its fight with gravity and the sickening lurch of a freefall that felt like it lasted a lifetime. When the chopper hit the scrub-covered ravine, it didn't just land, it disintegrated. The impact was a physical erasure of consciousness, a whiteout of sound and fury that left Reeves buried under a tomb of twisted aluminum and hydraulic fluid. Major, stay with us." The voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep well. Reeves clawed his way back to the surface of lucidity, his lungs burning with the scent of JP-8 fuel and charred earth. He tried to move, but his left side felt like it had been fused to the airframe. Through a haze of dust and blood, he saw the blurred shapes of his recon Marines moving through the wreckage, their headlamps cutting frantic arcs through the midnight gloom. "Status," Reeves wheezed, the word catching on a mouthful of copper-tasting grit. "Birds down, sir. Search and rescue is 20 out, but you're bleeding out fast," a sergeant yelled, pressing a frantic hand against Reeves' shoulder. "The base hospital is too far. We're diverting the medevac to the civilian trauma center in Oceanside. It's the only way you make it." Reeves wanted to protest. He wanted to demand a Navy surgeon, a man who understood that a Marine's body was a machine built for high-impact trauma. He didn't want civilian hands, soft hands, touching him. But the darkness was closing in again, a heavy velvet curtain pulling across his vision. The transition was a blur of agony, the jolting vibration of a gurney, the strobe light flicker of overhead fluorescence, and the sudden, jarring transition from the cold night air to the sterile, stifling heat of an emergency room. "Trauma 1. We have a catastrophic arrival, blunt force to the chest, possible internal hemorrhaging," a voice shouted. Reeves' eyes snapped open as the gurney slammed into the bay. The smell hit him first, not the honest scent of gunpowder and sweat, but the cloying, chemical stench of antiseptic and floor wax. He looked up and saw faces that didn't belong in his world. They wore bright, clean scrubs and expressions of panicked uncertainty. They looked like people who spent their weekends at farmers' markets, not in the trenches. He felt the snip of trauma shears cutting through his scorched flight suit, stripping away his armor, his rank, and his dignity. To them he was just a broken body, a puzzle to be solved. To him they were an obstacle to survival. He tried to sit up, his muscles screaming in a discordant symphony of protest, his heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs. Where is the corpseman? Reeves growled, pushing a nurse's hand away with a strength that defied his mangled state. Give me a real doctor. Get me back to the base. Major, you're in no condition to move, a young man in a white coat said, his voice trembling slightly as he looked at the sheer amount of blood coating Reeves' uniform. Reeves gripped the side of the metal rails, his knuckles white, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He looked around the room, searching for a face that knew the red zone, but all he saw was a sea of civilian incompetence. He was a predator trapped in a cage of sheep, and as the monitors began a frantic, high-pitched chirping, he realized with a jolt of pure terror that his heart wasn't just racing, it was drowning. Yet, as the young doctor reached for a sedative to quiet the combative patient, a pair of steady, weathered hands moved into Reeves' line of sight, pushing the needle away with a firm, practiced authority that stopped the room cold. Reeves looked up, prepared to snarl, but the woman standing over him didn't look like the others. She was looking at his injuries with a cold, calculating intensity that he had only ever seen on a battlefield, and for a split second, the frantic pounding in his chest skipped a beat for an entirely different reason. The world returned in jagged, painful fragments of fluorescent white and the rhythmic, mocking hiss thump of a blood pressure cuff. Major Nathan Reeves blinked, his eyelashes matted with dried salt and something thicker, darker. His head felt like it had been used for target practice, a dull, throbbing ache radiating from his temples to the base of his skull. The last thing he remembered was the smell of burning JP8 and the terrifying sensation of his ribs being crushed by an invisible hand. He tried to shift his weight, but a sharp, lightning bolt of agony shot through his chest, pinning him back against the thin, crinkling paper of the ER gurney. He wasn't in the field anymore. He was in a cage of glass and steel, surrounded by the sterile hum of a civilian world that felt dangerously soft. Easy now, Major. You're safe. You're at mercy, General. The voice was calm, annoyingly melodic, and lacked the bark of authority he craved. Reeves forced his eyes to focus. Standing over him was a woman who looked like she belonged behind a PDA bake sale table, not in a trauma bay. She had strands of silver woven into a loose bun and hazel eyes that held a look of motherly concern. A look that, to a man who had spent 2 decades in the shadow of death, felt like an insult. Her name tag read Sarah Mitchell, RN. She wasn't wearing the digital camouflage of a Navy corpsman or the sharp, pressed uniform of a military officer. She wore faded blue scrubs with a tiny butterfly pin on the lapel. To Reeves, she was the personification of civilian comfort, a soccer mom who likely spent her afternoons worrying about orange slices and carpool lanes. I need a real doctor, Reeves rasped, his voice sounding like 2 stones grinding together. He tried to swat away the pulse oximeter she was trying to clip to his finger. Where's the flight surgeon? Call Pendleton. The flight surgeon is 60 miles away, and you don't have 60 minutes, Sarah replied, her voice remaining level as she gently but firmly recaptured his hand. Her touch was warm, but Reeves recoiled as if burned. He didn't want warmth, he wanted competence. He wanted someone who spoke the language of kinetic energy and blast radiuses. He looked past her, searching the hallway for someone, anyone, who looked like they had seen a fight. Instead, he saw a young orderly scrolling on a phone and a janitor pushing a yellow bucket. The lack of urgency was suffocating. He felt his heart skip, a strange, hollow thud in the center of his chest that made his breath hitch. You don't understand, Reeves gritted out, his vision beginning to swim at the edges. My body, it's not like yours. I have shrapnel in my hip from '06 and a cardiac history that would blow your civilian monitors. You're out of your league, lady. Get me someone who has actually been in the grit. Sarah didn't flinch. She leaned over him to check the monitor, her face inches from his. Up close, he noticed the fine lines around her eyes and the way her hands moved with a strange, practiced economy. But his prejudice was a thick shield. He saw the soft curve of her jaw and the gentle way she adjusted his pillow, and he felt a surge of genuine panic. He was dying in a room full of people who thought trauma was a fender bender on the way to a soccer game. I've handled plenty of grit, Major, she said softly, though the words didn't reach his ears with any weight. She turned to the cart, her back to him as she prepared a syringe. Right now, I need you to trust that I know exactly what I'm looking at. Reeves let out a sharp, derisive exhale that ended in a wince. Trust? I trust the men I bleed with. I don't trust a woman who probably thinks a tourniquet is a fashion accessory. You see a soldier, but you have no idea what's happening inside me. You're looking for a heartbeat and I'm waiting for a detonator to go off in my chest. He closed his eyes, the frustration boiling over into a cold, dark dread. He was a recon Marine, a warrior who had survived the hellfire of Marja, and now he was going to flatline while a grandmotherly nurse offered him a cup of water and a sympathetic smile. As his consciousness began to ebb again, a wave of nausea rolling over him, he felt Sarah's hand slide under the sleeve of his gown to check his brachial pulse. He didn't see the way her eyes darkened as she felt the specific, irregular rhythm of his failing heart, a rhythm that had nothing to do with anxiety and everything to do with the fluid slowly strangling his life. But as she pulled her hand away, Sarah's own sleeve caught on the corner of the metal gurney, hitching upward just an inch. For a fleeting second, a flash of dark, jagged ink peeked out from the underside of her forearm, a mark so out of place on her skin that it seemed to vibrate against the sterile white of the room. The overhead lights seemed to pulse in time with the thundering pressure behind Nathan Reeves' ribs. Each breath was a tactical struggle, a shallow, desperate grab for oxygen that felt like sucking air through a crushed straw. He could feel his internal systems redlining, the primal alarm bells of his body screaming that the hull was breached. But to the man standing at the foot of his bed, Reeves wasn't a dying warrior. He was a problem to be silenced. Dr. Evans, the surgical resident on call, looked like he hadn't slept since the previous fiscal year. His white coat was pristine, but his eyes were wide with the flickering uncertainty of someone who knew the theory but feared the practice. He stared at the monitor, where Reeves' heart rate was climbing toward a dangerous 140 beats per minute. "He's hyperventilating," Evans muttered, more to himself than to the staff. He looked at Reeves' chart, then back at the blood-streaked face of the Marine. "Major, you're having a panic attack. It's a common physiological response to a high-impact trauma, especially with your history. We call it an acute stress reaction." Reeves tried to roar, but it came out as a wet, ragged wheeze. "Not panic. Chest crushing. It's the adrenaline, Major. Your sympathetic nervous system is stuck in overdrive," Evans said, his voice taking on a patronizing, clinical lilt. He turned toward the medicine cart. "Let's get 5 milligrams of midazolam on board. We need to bring him down before he blows a vessel. He's combative because he's crashing from the PTSD spike." Sarah Mitchell stepped forward, her quiet presence suddenly heavy. She didn't look at the resident, she was looking at the hollow of Reeves' throat. While Evans was busy calculating a sedative dose to knock the Major into a chemical stupor, Sarah's eyes were locked on the jugular veins. They weren't just visible, they were bulging, distended ropes of blue tension that stood out against the sweat-slicked skin of Reeves' neck. "Doctor, look at his neck," Sarah said. Her voice wasn't a suggestion, it was a directive. "And look at his blood pressure. It's dropping as his heart rate climbs. That's not a panic attack. It's compensatory tachycardia, Sarah," Evans snapped, his ego bristling at the interruption from a nurse he viewed as a glorified babysitter. "He's a high-performance athlete in shock. The midazolam will stabilize the respiratory rate. Give the sedative." Sarah didn't move toward the syringe. She moved toward Reeves, her hands hovering just above his chest. She saw the Beck's triad forming as clearly as a storm front on a radar. The muffled heart sound she'd heard moments ago, the rising venous pressure in his neck, and the plummeting blood pressure. The fluid was filling the sac around his heart, strangling the muscle until it could no longer expand. "If you sedate him, you'll kill him," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a register of pure, cold steel. "His heart is struggling against a tamponade. You suppress his respiratory drive now, and he won't have the strength to fight the pressure. He needs a needle in his chest, not a sedative in his vein." Evans scoffed, reaching for the syringe himself. "He's a combat vet with a tough guy complex who's losing his mind in a civilian ER. I'm the Dr. Mitchell. I've made the call. Administer the midazolam or move out of the way." Reeves watched the exchange through a narrowing tunnel of gray. He saw the soccer mom standing her ground against the man with the degree, her eyes flashing with a fire that seemed entirely at odds with her faded scrubs. He felt his consciousness slipping, the world tilting into a dark, silent abyss. Just as Evans stepped forward to plunge the sedative into the foreport, Sarah's hand shot out, her grip like a vice around the doctor's wrist. As her scrub sleeve shifted further up in the struggle, the light caught the full silhouette of the ink on her arm, the unmistakable, jagged wings of the Marine Corps eagle, globe, and anchor. But it was what lay beneath the tattoo that made Reeves' heart stop before the fluid even had the chance. A set of deep, puckered burn scars that only came from one thing, white phosphorus. The room was tilting. Nathan Reeves felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the atmosphere pressing down on him, a physical force that made every heartbeat feel like a hammer striking an anvil. The monitor's alarm had shifted from a frantic chirp to a sustained, panicked wail. Through the haze of his failing vision, he saw Dr. Evans breaking free from Sarah's grip, the syringe of midazolam poised like a weapon. The resident's face was flushed with the dangerous arrogance of a man who mistook a title for absolute truth. "Stay back, Sarah. That's an order." Evans barked, his voice cracking under the pressure of the dying man in front of him. Reeves' hand, a scarred instrument of war that had survived IEDs and hand-to-hand combat in the dark corners of the world, shot out with the last of his fading strength. He didn't grab the doctor. In his delirium, fueled by a lifetime of trusting only those who had earned it through blood, he lashed out at the nearest perceived threat. He caught Sarah Mitchell by the wrist, his grip tightening with bone-crushing force. "Don't touch me," he rasped, the words rattling in his chest like loose stones. He pulled her closer, his eyes bloodshot and wild, searching her face for the weakness he was certain was there. "You, a civilian. You don't know what this is. You haven't earned the right to see a Marine die." The orderlies moved in to pry his fingers loose, but Sarah waved them off with a sharp, silent command of her hand. She didn't flinch at the pain in her wrist, nor did she recoil from the spray of blood that escaped his lips as he coughed. She leaned into his space, her face inches from his, defying the wall of hostility he had built around himself. "You think this is about you, Major?" she hissed, her voice a low, vibrating hum that seemed to cut through the roar in his ears. "You think you're the only one who knows the cost of that uniform? You're acting like a private on his first deployment, blinded by your own shadow. I am the only thing standing between you and a body bag, and you're worried about my credentials." "I asked for a corpsman," Reeves managed, his fingers trembling but refusing to let go. He looked at her soft, silver-streaked hair and the butterfly pin on her chest, a symbol of a world he had long ago abandoned. "I don't need a mother's touch. I need a warrior." The tension in the room was a living thing, a coiled spring ready to snap. Dr. Evans was shouting for security, his hand hovering over the foreport, ready to plunge the sedative that Sarah knew would be the final nail in Reeves' coffin. The Major was fading, his grip on her wrist beginning to slip as his blood pressure bottomed out, his body finally surrendering to the fluid crushing his heart. Sarah looked down at his hand, then back into his eyes, a strange, grim smile touching her lips. It wasn't the smile of a nurse. It was the cold, knowing smirk of a veteran who had seen the worst the world had to offer and lived to tell the tale. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned in even closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that only he could hear over the screaming of the machines. "You want a warrior, Nathan? You better start looking closer," she said, her eyes locking onto his with a terrifying, familiar intensity. She reached up with her free hand, her fingers gripping the hem of her left scrub sleeve. The movement was slow, deliberate, and carried the weight of a decade of silence. As she began to roll the fabric upward, revealing the scarred, ink-stained skin beneath, the air in the trauma bay seemed to vanish, and Reeves felt a jolt of recognition so sharp it bypassed his dying heart and struck his very soul. But as the first curve of the black ink emerged, the monitor behind them let out a long, terrifying flatline, and Sarah's expression shifted from defiance to a cold, lethal focus that had nothing to do with nursing and everything to do with combat. The high-pitched, continuous drone of the flatline tore through the room, a digital death knell that sent the medical team into a frantic, disjointed scramble. Dr. Evans lunged forward, his face pale, the syringe of midazolam forgotten as he reached for the paddles of the defibrillator. "He's in P. Start compressions. Get him down." Nathan Reeves felt the world dissolving into a cold, gray mist. The sounds of the ER became a muffled underwater echo. His grip on Sarah's wrist finally failed, his heavy arm dropping onto the thin mattress like lead. His heart was no longer a pump. It was a trapped bird, fluttering its last against the suffocating pressure of the pericardial sac. He was drifting into the dark, his mind flickering with the faces of the men he'd lost in the valleys of Afghanistan. Then Sarah Mitchell moved. She didn't move like a nurse rushing to a code. She moved with the predatory, explosive grace of a soldier breaching a room. With a violent tug, she ripped her left sleeve all the way to the shoulder. "Look at me, Major," she commanded, her voice a thunderclap that seemed to reach into the void and pull Reeves back by the throat. Nathan's eyes flickered open, his pupils blown wide. He saw it. Etched into the pale skin of her bicep was a large, faded and battle-worn eagle, globe, and anchor. It wasn't the clean, decorative ink of a recruit. It was the jagged, deep black work of a field artist, scarred by a long, puckered line of white phosphorus burns that cut right through the eagle's wings. Beneath the emblem were 3 small hand-poked characters that made the breath catch in Reeves' throat. 3 out of 5. The Dark Horse Battalion. The Hellfire Unit from Marja. Reeves' heart didn't just skip, it seemed to freeze in his chest. He wasn't looking at a civilian. He was looking at a devil document. He was looking at a Navy corpsman who had walked through the same fire he had, a woman who carried the same unit history in her skin that he carried in his nightmares. The soccer mom mask had vanished, replaced by the 1,000-yard stare of a veteran who had performed field surgery in the dirt while being suppressed by PKM fire. "Sarah, what are you doing? Step back," Evans yelled, reaching to shove her aside so he could begin the chest compressions that would surely rupture Reeves' struggling heart. Sarah didn't look at the doctor. Her eyes remained locked on Reeves, a silent, unbreakable bond forming between the 2 warriors in the midst of the chaos. She saw the recognition in his eyes, the moment his prejudice shattered and was replaced by a desperate, dying trust. "I've got you, Marine," she whispered, her voice like a jagged blade of ice. In one fluid motion, she reached for the large-bore trauma needle on the sterile tray, ignoring the security guards bursting through the double doors and the residents' panicked screams. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for a surgeon. She hovered the steel tip over the notch just below his breastbone, her hands as steady as a sniper's on a cold morning. But as the needle's tip touched his skin, the monitor's flatline didn't just continue, it was joined by the sound of the hospital's code blue alarm, and the young resident grabbed Sarah's arm, his face twisted in a mask of legal terror that threatened to end the rescue before the first drop of fluid could be drained. The code blue alarm was a banshee's wail, a shrill rhythmic scream that signaled the end of the line. Nathan Reeves was gone. His head had rolled to the side, his jaw slack, his skin the color of a winter fog. On the monitor, the flat line was a cruel horizontal horizon of zero hope. "Get out of the way, Mitchell. You're obstructing a code," Dr. Evans screamed, his voice hitting a frantic, hysterical pitch. He grabbed Sarah's shoulder, trying to yank her away from the bed. "Security, get her off him." 2 burly guards charged into the bay, their hands reaching for their belts, but they hesitated for a fraction of a second. There was something in Sarah's posture, the way her feet were braced, the way her eyes had narrowed into twin points of lethal focus, that didn't belong to a nurse. She looked like a woman holding a perimeter against an advancing tide. "If you start compressions, you will rupture the pericardium and kill him instantly," Sarah roared, her voice echoing off the sterile tiles with a command that paralyzed the guards. "He has a tamponade. The blood is crushing his heart. Move or I will move you. He's flatlined. We have to pump his chest." Evans lunged forward, his hands locked and ready to plunge onto Reeves' sternum. Sarah didn't hesitate. It wasn't a nurse's intervention, it was a combat reflex. As Evans leaned in, Sarah dropped her shoulder and drove it into the resident's chest, a textbook tackle that sent the doctor reeling back into a crash cart, sending trays of surgical steel clattering to the floor. "Assault. She's assaulting the staff," a nurse screamed, but Sarah was already back over Reeves. She ignored the chaos. She ignored the guards now closing in on her. She saw only the small triangle of skin just below the major xiphoid process. In her mind, the sterile ER faded away, replaced by the grit-choked air of a poppy field and the sound of distant rotors. She remembered a boy, barely 20, with the same graying pallor as Reeves, and how she had saved him with a needle and a prayer. "Hold him," she commanded the nearest orderly, who was too stunned to do anything but obey. With a precision that defied the adrenaline surging through her veins, Sarah angled the long trauma needle 60 degrees toward Reeves' left shoulder. The security guards reached her just as she felt the needle pierce the tough, fibrous sac surrounding the heart. A guard grabbed her right arm, twisting it back, while the other tackled her from the side, forcing her toward the floor. But Sarah didn't let go of the needle. Even as she was being dragged down, her knees hitting the linoleum with a sickening thud, she saw the first jet of dark, pressurized blood surge into the syringe. The pressure was being relieved. The strangler was letting go. "Let her go. Look at the monitor," the orderly yelled. The flatline had broken. A single, weak, erratic spike appeared on the screen, followed by another. Then a ragged, gasping sound tore from Reeves' throat, the sound of a man being dragged back from the gates of hell. But as Reeves' chest began to heave with the first signs of returning life, the click of handcuffs echoed through the room. Sarah Mitchell felt the cold steel bite into her wrists as she was hauled to her feet, her scrub sleeve still rolled up to reveal the scarred Marine Corps tattoo that had started it all. Evans, trembling with rage and humiliation, pointed a shaking finger at her. "You're done, Mitchell. I'm pressing charges. You'll never touch a patient again." Sarah didn't look at the doctor. She looked at Reeves, whose eyes were fluttering open, his gaze immediately finding the ink on her arm. He was alive, but as the police began to lead her out of the trauma bay in shame, the monitor suddenly began to beep a new, frantic warning that no one, not even Sarah, had anticipated. The silence of the holding cell was a jarring contrast to the frantic pulse of the ER. Sarah Mitchell sat on the edge of the hard wooden bench, her hands still cuffed behind her back. The steel was cold against her skin, but the ache in her wrists was nothing compared to the phantom heat radiating from her left bicep. Every time she closed her eyes, she didn't see the fluorescent lights of Mercy General. She saw the blinding, white-hot magnesium flare of a phosphorus grenade. The door groaned open, and a seasoned police sergeant entered, followed by a man in a sharp suit who looked like he smelled of high-priced cedar and litigation. It was the hospital's legal counsel. "You've got a hell of a lot of explaining to do, Mitchell," the sergeant said, leaning against the cinderblock wall. "Dr. Evans is filing for aggravated assault and practicing medicine without a license. He says you went rogue and nearly butchered a patient." Sarah looked up, her hazel eyes devoid of the soccer mom warmth Reeves had mocked. They were cold, flat, and ancient. "I saved a life the only way it could be saved. Evans was going to kill a Marine because he couldn't see past his own textbook." The lawyer stepped forward, his eyes landing on her exposed bicep where the eagle, globe, and anchor sat amidst the wreckage of her skin. "And this? The tattoos? The burns? The hospital records say you were a civilian hire 15 years ago. There's no mention of a military record in your HR file." Sarah let out a short, dry laugh. "That's because Sarah Mitchell didn't exist in 2010. Back then I was Petty Officer Sarah Doc Jenkins. I didn't put it in the file because I didn't want the questions. I wanted to be a nurse, not a museum exhibit for what happened in Marja." She leaned back, the memory finally breaking through the levee. "We were pinned down in a mud-walled compound. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. The Dark Horse. A Willie Pete, white phosphorus, round cooked off in the ammo crate next to us. It's a chemical fire that doesn't go out. It burns through skin, muscle, and bone until there's nothing left. I had to choose, drop the wounded Marine I was patching and run, or stay and finish the line while the phosphorus ate my arm." She looked down at the jagged, puckered scars that distorted the Marine Corps emblem. "I finished the line. They gave me a silver star and a medical discharge. I changed my name after the divorce, moved here, and tried to forget the sound of screaming. But you don't forget the hellfire. And you don't let one of your own die because a resident is too proud to look at a neck vein." The lawyer's phone buzzed aggressively on the table. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting from clinical disdain to genuine shock. He looked at the sergeant, then back at Sarah. "That was the hospital administrator," the lawyer whispered. "Major Reeves just woke up. He's refusing to let anyone touch him until he speaks to his commanding officer. And he's not talking about the base commander." The sergeant frowned. "Who's he talking about?" Sarah felt a strange, familiar prickle at the back of her neck. "Me." The lawyer cleared his throat, his voice suddenly shaky. "He also mentioned that if a single hair on your head is harmed, he's going to make sure the JAG office treats this hospital like an enemy combatant. But that's not the problem, Sarah. The problem is what he said about the needle." Sarah stood up, the cuffs rattling. "Is he stable?" "He's breathing," the lawyer said, his face paling. "But he's demanding to know why you only drained half the fluid. He says you knew there was something else inside that chest cavity, something the scans missed." The handcuffs didn't stay on for long. When a recon Marine major starts making threats that involve the Pentagon and the Joint Chiefs, bureaucracy has a way of melting. Sarah was escorted back to the ICU, not as a prisoner but as a reluctant consultant. The atmosphere had shifted from hostile to terrified. Dr. Evans was gone, reportedly sent home on administrative leave, and the remaining staff moved around Sarah like she was a live grenade with the pin pulled. She found Reeves propped up on the pillows, his face still ghostly but his eyes sharp and dangerous. When he saw her, his jaw tightened. He didn't look at her face, he looked at the 3/5 tattoo on her arm. "The needle only bought me time, didn't it, Doc?" Reeves' voice was a low growl, devoid of its earlier vitriol. "You're smarter than you look, Major," Sarah replied, stepping up to the monitor. She didn't need the digital readouts to know the truth. The rhythm was back, but it was labored. There was a subtle, rhythmic thump, audible even without a stethoscope, a mechanical discordance. "The scan showed fluid," she said, her voice dropping to that lethal, tactical calm. "But it didn't show the source. A training accident doesn't cause a tamponade that aggressive unless something is actively tearing you apart from the inside. The blunt force from the crash didn't just bruise you. It shifted the souvenir you've been carrying since Ramadi. Reeves closed his eyes, a grimace of realization crossing his face. The shrapnel. It's a jagged piece of steel, less than a centimeter long, Sarah explained, turning to the head of the ICU. It was lodged in the connective tissue near his aorta for 20 years. The impact of the crash dislodged it. It's not just sitting there, it's vibrating with every heartbeat, acting like a saw blade. I drained the fluid, but the blade is still moving. If it nicks the aortic wall, he doesn't just crash, he explodes. The room went cold. The hospital's chief of surgery, a man who had been ready to sign Sarah's arrest warrant an hour ago, stepped forward. We need to get him into the OR immediately for an emergency thoracotomy. But our cardiothoracic lead is stuck in a multi-car pileup on the I-5. He's 30 minutes out. He doesn't have 30 minutes, Sarah said, her eyes locked on the monitor. A tiny, jagged spike appeared on the EKG, a premature ventricular contraction. The saw blade had just moved again. Suddenly the doors swung open. Two men in dark suits, internal affairs and hospital risk management, stepped in. Nurse Mitchell, you are under a strict cease and desist order. If you so much as pick up a scalpel, you will be facing federal charges for impersonating a surgeon. The hospital cannot afford the liability of a field medic performing open-heart surgery. Reeves let out a dry, rattling laugh. He looked at the men in suits, then at the terrified surgical residents and finally at Sarah. He reached out, his hands steady now, and gripped the edge of her scrub top, pulling her down until they were eye to eye. "Doc," he whispered, the sound of a man placing his final bet. "I don't care about their liability. I don't care about their licenses. That piece of Ramadi is trying to finish the job. You're the only one in this building who's ever operated under fire. Do it." "Major, if I open you up and fail, I'm going to prison for the rest of my life," Sarah said. "And if you don't," Reeves replied, his grip tightening as his heart monitor began to wail a new, frantic warning, "I'm going to a cemetery, and you're going to have to live with the fact that you let a brother-in-arms die because you were afraid of a piece of paper." The monitor flatlined. Not a slow fade this time, but a violent, electric silence. The shrapnel had finally found its mark. Sarah didn't look at the suits. She didn't look at the guards. She grabbed a tray of sterile instruments and looked at the head nurse. "Get me a scalpel and a rib spreader," Sarah commanded. "And someone tell the police they're going to need more handcuffs because I'm going in." As the first incision was made, the sound of sirens began to wail outside, but they weren't ambulances. They were the heavy, synchronized rumble of a fleet of military Humvees screaming toward the hospital entrance. The fluorescent hum of the Oceanside Police Precinct was a grating, sterile sound that felt miles away from the visceral, blood-slicked reality of the ICU. Sarah Mitchell sat at a metal processing desk, her hands finally free of cuffs, but her spirit weighed down by the impending collapse of her life. She had saved him. She had reached into the cavity of his chest and plucked out a jagged sliver of Iraqi steel just seconds before his aorta shredded, but the cost was her career. The charges were stacked high: assault, practicing medicine without a license, and reckless endangerment. The heavy double doors at the front of the precinct slammed open with a force that made the duty sergeant jump. The sound of rhythmic, metallic clicking echoed off the linoleum, the sound of a man walking with a cane and the grim determination of a heat-seeking missile. Major Nathan Reeves looked like he should have been in a graveyard, or at the very least, a high-dependency ward. His chest was heavily bandaged beneath a loose-fitting tactical jacket. His face was gaunt, and his stride was hitched, but his eyes were the color of a storm-tossed Atlantic. "Major Reeves? You're supposed to be in recovery," the chief of police said, stepping out of his office with a look of stunned disbelief. "We're just finalizing the paperwork on the Mitchell woman. Dr. Evans is an arrogant coward who almost let a commanding officer die because he couldn't read a pulse." Reeves' voice rumbled, louder and steadier than it had any right to be. He reached the processing desk and looked down at Sarah. For the first time, there was no prejudice in his gaze, no soccer mom dismissal. There was only the solemn, terrifying respect of one survivor looking at another. Reeves reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet-lined case. With a sharp clack, he dropped the heavy, star-shaped metal onto the desk. The bronze glinted under the harsh lights. A silver star, the nation's third highest award for valor. "That's not for the charges," Reeves said, staring directly at the chief. "That's a reminder. That woman didn't just practice medicine. She conducted a rescue operation in the middle of your hospital. She outranks every man in this room in moral authority, and if you think for 1 second I'm letting you prosecute a Navy corpsman for doing what your civilian experts were too terrified to attempt, you've got a war on your hands." The chief looked at the medal, then at the bandaged warrior, and finally at Sarah's scarred 3/5 tattoo. The room went silent. The paperwork on the desk suddenly looked very small. "Drop the charges," the chief muttered to the clerk. "All of them." An hour later, the sun was beginning to dip below the Pacific horizon, casting long golden shadows over the precinct parking lot. Sarah stood by her car, breathing in the salt air she thought she'd never taste as a free woman again. A shadow fell over her. Reeves was leaning against the fender of a blacked-out SUV, 2 steaming paper cups in his hands. He handed her one. "Black. Like a sea ration," he grunted. Sarah took a sip, the warmth spreading through her tired limbs. "You shouldn't be out of bed, Major. And you shouldn't have been in a holding cell, Doc," he replied. He looked out at the ocean, his posture relaxing for the first time since the crash. "I'm sorry for what I said in the bay. I saw the scrubs and forgot that the most dangerous people usually don't wear a uniform." Sarah looked at the faded ink on her arm, then back at him. "We're never really out of uniform, Nathan. We just changed the fabric." They sat there in the quiet of the evening, a major and a nurse, a marine and a corpsman, sharing a coffee in the silence that only those who have walked through the hellfire truly understand. Major Reeves almost died because he couldn't see the warrior standing right in front of him. How many heroes in your own life are you overlooking right now? If this story reminded you that the strongest people are often the ones we least expect, show it. Hitting that subscribe button costs you nothing, but it helps us keep telling the stories of those who gave everything. Like the video if Sarah's courage moved you, and comment, "I see you," to honor the quiet warriors in your life. Don't let the algorithm bury their legacy.